Tom, this must be one of the world's foremost aircraft maintenance facilities. It's not quite the same as a vehicle garage, is it?
It is one of the best in the world. No, it's not like a garage. But this film's about inspection routine. And here, carrying out a thorough inspection in a routine, that's a vital component in a system that's totally focused on safety.
The MOT test is a safety check that needs to be done thoroughly, so I do see the connection here.
But it's the routine that's important, following the same pattern every time. That's the best way to ensure that nothing gets missed.
I feel a test coming on.
How perceptive of you, Robert.
This is our vehicle, and the testing station should already have some information about it from when the appointment was made or when it arrived for test, such as make, model, reg number, etc.
Yeah, and usually the class of vehicle will already have been identified. It's normally obvious. However, when the tester carries out the pre-checks, they should ensure that both they and the VTS are authorised to test that class of vehicle. Another thing, if they're not diesel testing, they need to make sure it's not a diesel.
Anything else to consider on pre-checks, Tom?
Yeah, the test equipment must physically be able to accommodate the vehicle. It should be able to get it on the lift or over the pit. Now, this can be an issue, say, with motorhomes or narrow track vehicles.
Oh, yes. And I remember from the diesel films that a bit of maintenance history is handy, including making sure that the cam belt is in good condition.
That's absolutely right. And something that may sound obvious, but the keys must be available for all the locks, because they'll need to open everything they're supposed to open to carry out the test. So they need to open doors. That includes side-loading doors, tailgate, boot, bonnet on some vehicles, and the fuel filler cap.
If the test is unable to open any of those, do they refuse to test the vehicle?
Absolutely right. They should also refuse to test in any of the other circumstances that are listed in Section 2 of the Introduction to the Inspection Manual. So, for example, if they think there's a danger to themselves or to others, or to the vehicle or to property. And these reasons to refuse to test are also listed in Appendix 3 of the MOT 6th edition guide.
And what are the other reasons to refuse to test? I suppose one must be that the vehicle's incapable of being driven and completing the test, so we need to ensure there's sufficient fuel and oil, for example.
Yes, we do. Also, other reasons to refuse to test: the vehicle or any part of the equipment may be so dirty that it makes an examination unreasonably difficult. It could be that the exhaust produces substantial quantities of avoidable smoke.
OK, that's fairly obvious. What about any documentation that's needed for the test?
Documentation's not normally required, but you could have a vehicle, say, that has a cherished registration number, or it could be that the year letter of the registration doesn't make it clear what standard needs to be applied. Now, seatbelt requirement on a D prefix plate, that's a good example. Now, the presenter may need to produce the registration certificate, and if it's not available, the tester could refuse to test. However, it's worth checking the MOT database, because that may have the information.
And I know some test stations charge a fee up front. Does the presenter get their money back if the garage refuses to test?
Yes, they do. And on the other side of the coin, excuse the pun, if a testing station asks for the fee in advance and they don't get it, that's a reason to refuse to test.
That's fair enough. What about vehicles with foreign number plates or unregistered vehicles? The tester's surely going to need some details to enter the test on the VTS device.
That's correct. The registration, VIN, chassis or frame number, these are all needed. And if they're all missing, illegible, or they contain letters that are not part of the English language, these are a reason to refuse to test, because the tester wouldn't be able to identify that vehicle.
And does the tester enter the refusal to test details on the VTS device?
Only if the presenter requires written confirmation does the tester need to register it. And then they would have to produce a VT30 that clearly showed the reasons why they couldn't carry out the test. And then, of course, they would abandon the test.
And what about these circumstances you described earlier where there's no legible VIN or registration mark?
Right, in that situation, they would need to complete a VT30 by hand and put as much detail of the vehicle on as they could, and then they would have to keep a copy.
OK, having established that the vehicle is fit to test, I guess the tester enters it on the VTS device and is then ready to begin the inspection routine. But what routine does the tester follow? Right.
To help the tester, there's two diagrams in the inspection manual of the recommended routine. There's the Topside and the Underside. And this information is also available on the VTS device. The routine can be followed in most every situation, but the layout of some test stations doesn't suit it, as does the design of some vehicles, for example quads. The important thing to remember is that the tester has a sound inspection routine and they keep to it. Now we'll register the test, print off the VT40 checklist, and we'll start our inspection routine in the driver's seat. Remember, only the tester who registered on the VTS device can carry out that test. After you've finished your checks from the driver's seat, get out and move around to the front near side. Cross the front and then down the offside, working your way to the rear, checking in the passenger compartment as you pass. Then move across the rear, checking outside and then inside the boot or cargo area. Now move down the near side to the front of the vehicle, repeating the checks done on the offside, and finally finish with the under bonnet check. If it's all right with you, I'll go this side.
Good idea.
Here we are inside the vehicle. I've got my VT40 MOT inspection checklist. It's got all the relevant information about the vehicle and the vehicle specific information. Some testers ask, when they're using this checklist on the back on different items, do they need to tick all the pass and fail boxes? Well, no, they don't. But this document is ideal for recording failure items and advisory items.
This isn't actually going to be a real test though, is it?
No, we'll be concentrating on the routine rather than specific details of testable items. As you well know, there's good information that focuses on sections of the inspection manual that's contained in the back catalogue and subsequent DVDs that have been produced for MOT matters.
I suppose one of the most important things about an inspection routine is that by doing things in a methodical order means that test items are less likely to be missed.
That's exactly the point of it. There are just so many things to check on a test that items could be missed. But following that recommended routine in a logical progression, we find it works very well to safeguard against missing items.
So where do we start in here, Tom?
Right, well, you've probably heard me say this many times. I'll try and say it differently. Throughout this process, I'll be checking presence. Is the component there? Security, how well is it fixed? The condition of the component, satisfied with all of that, check the operation. And of course, you'll do this very quickly on most items. Lots of testers, once they're sat in the driver's seat, will have different points from where they start their check. For me, it's as far as I can go over to the near side, and I'll be checking, does this door open and close from the inside? That brings me up to the rear view mirror, check that, and then onto the windscreen. Coming across the windscreen brings me to the interior mirror, and then to this side of the windscreen, checking that the sun visor is secure. And then I come down to the view in this mirror, and then check that the door is secure in a closed position. And then switch on the ignition. And at that point I can check for such things as, say, ABS lamp. And now I can operate the washers and the wipers, and that completes that check in terms of the view of the road. Then that brings me to light switches. I can operate the light switches, dip, main beam, rear fog telltales, then onto the indicators. Yep, and then that brings me down to hazards, checking with the ignition on this vehicle. I'll check the horn, turn the ignition off, check the hazards with the ignition off.
Now this vehicle hasn't been modified, but the test applies to disabled driver controls, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. However, if those disabled controls are additional to the normal controls and they and their fittings don't adversely affect the operation of the normal controls, then they would not be a testable item. Otherwise, they're just tested in the normal way. And that information can be found in paragraph 7 in the section How to Use the Manual. For me now, I move on to the foot brake and or service brake, and I carry out all the checks on there, and then I start the engine up, complete that dip check. Then I move on to the park brake and carry out all the checks on the park brake and its operation and all the prescribed area that I can see from inside the vehicle. I leave the park brake in the off position. Check condition of the steering wheel and the column and the top bush. Yeah, go through the process. I can never see the road wheel. I've never been able to, so step out. Oh, goody, the door opens. That's handy. And then just check the free play on the steering.
Would you do power steering now as well?
Could, yes. We have the engine running to cover that, and I would have, feel it, the movement, feel the effect of it. And now I can turn the engine off. And
then what about any steering coupling and the foot pedals themselves?
Right. For me, I'll do that check now. I've got my torch here, always at the ready, and I can check up in here, looking at all of those components, and also up in here, there's going to be most probably prescribed area that I can look at. A lot of testers prefer to do that check when they raise the vehicle, say on a hoist, about halfway, but I do it this time. And that prescribed area then brings me round to the inner sill and the doorstep, the B-post, right up through to the top. Yeah. Then I'll check the security of the seat, particularly the seat back. And on this seat, the seat belt is integral to the seat. So then I check the condition of the seat belt and its operation and couple it up with the seat unoccupied. Yep. Step outside the vehicle, close the door, and that's me finished. Yeah. Now you can stay where you are, Robert, or you can grab my checklist for me and join me around the front of the vehicle.
I'll do that, Tom. Okay, Tom, this test facility has got convex mirrors, so it's possible to actually check the lights by sitting in the driver's seat. If the bay didn't have mirrors, we'd need an assistant here, wouldn't we?
Yes, you would. And the important thing to remember is that the tester must check all the items and make the observations and decisions about pass or fail. We talked about the checks we do on components, present security, and so on. On lamps, we do all of that. We also check if they flicker when tapped lightly by hand, and we check the interaction between lamps.
And would you do the aim check here too?
Yes, we would here, using the authorised equipment, because that's the way this is laid out. But a lot of test bays are laid out differently, and so maybe you'd be doing the headlamp aim later on during the test. Right, what else would we check while we're at the front of the vehicle?
Well, the front number plates, certainly, and sharp edges, perhaps caused by damage to bodywork or trim.
Yeah, and those sharp edges caused by damage or corrosion, we would check that on the entire body as we went around the vehicle. Now move across to the offside. When I'm round in this position, first thing I'm going to do is check the shock absorber bands.
And when you're checking the damping effect, you do need to be careful not to damage the vehicle, right?
Yes, that's why it says in the inspection manual that the tester can pull down from underneath if they've got any concerns. Now at this point, a lot of testers will then start to carry out checks on the tyres, particularly the size and type.
And on a class 5 to 5 or 7 vehicle, you also need to note the load and speed ratings as well as the tyre size and type.
Yes, you do. I don't start my tyre checks here. I prefer to do that when the vehicle's raised on the hoist and also when it's raised on the jack. Then I move along here, checking the body condition. There's a side repeater lamp here. Move on to the wipers, condition, security of the wipers. And then that brings me to the mirror. Now when I was inside, all I checked was the view in the mirror. Now it's a security, and I can see that the mirror is functional. Come along this part of the vehicle, we checked the door before, we've checked all that area, so it brings me straight on to the rear door. And I can check this rear passenger door, that it's securely latches, then open it completely. Got my torch here. We can check the back of the B-post. And along the doorstep and up the wheel arch, checking prescribed area, corrosion, and so on. Then we can check the inner sill and the floor pan, also prescribed area. And then security of the rear seat back, and then check the seat belts, going through that process, and that completes that part of it. Just close the door. And then check the tyre if that's the way you do it. That brings me to the fuel cap. Just open that, remove the cap, check the seal, put it all back in again, close it. And then it's the shock absorber dampen effect, and that brings me to the rear offside of the vehicle.
And at the rear, we check the lights, Tom, as we did at the front, unless we've already done that from the driver's seat using the mirrors, in which case we still need to check for flicker and security.
Exactly right. Anything else?
Presence of rear number plate and illumination, and then into the boot.
Yeah, when we check the boot or tailgate is securely latched in the closed position, which it is. We open the tailgate.
And Tom, would you lift the carpet up here to do this check?
If it was loose or didn't require any dismantling, so for example this vehicle, it's designed to lift up, so we can raise it up and we can check all the prescribed area. And this has also got little pockets at the side, which once again you just flick the little catch and you could get your torch, you can look in there. There could be corrosion around suspension points, security of shock absorbers, maybe fuel devices. You might even see some seatbelt attachments in there, but you can see as much as you can, yeah? Come right round, checking around the whole boot area, another little cover here, and finally get round to this point. And you can just place that back in. Easy as that. Close the tailgate.
And then you're back at the near side, so down the near side you do all of the checks as you did on the off side, and then you're back where you started.
Yeah, we're back at the front of the vehicle, and at that point we can then open the bonnet and go under and carry on with the under bonnet checks.
Okay.
Right, now we can start the under bonnet checks. Before I left the driver's seat, I would have released the bonnet catch. I just raised the bonnet there. And once again, systematic's the name of the game. Now I'm going to carry out checks without the engine running. So there's no health and safety implications. It's quite safe to do this work. Yeah. Got my torch here. Just start at this point and just follow around, checking components, the brake pipes, and checking prescribed area, suspension, coming right round. Then any fuel devices without the engine running, around brake components, just following around, prescribed area, coming around to this point, chassis or VIN number, and then just following around. So I've completed a circle, checking all those components.
And Tom, at some point you need to start the engine and perhaps use an assistant, yes?
Yeah, that's good timing because that's that point. Now if this were being used as an automated test lane, then I would have to start the engine, go around, start the engine, and I'd apply the brake pressure applicator, the pusher. So I've then got the brake components under pressure. And then if I was using an assistant, they would start the engine for me and they would put the brakes under pressure. And I'd check those brake components and I'd check the fuel devices with the engine now running. So I've gone round, yeah, repeating that circle. And then I'll have the steering rocked under load. Covers the engine's running, so it covers the eventuality of power steering, and I can check the power steering components. And I would end my under bonnet check by having checked steering components. Then I would close the bonnet and make sure that it's secured in a closed position. And that's it.
Great.
Next, we have the underside routine. Start at the front of the offside front wheel, work across the front of the vehicle, and then across an imaginary line between the front wheel centers. Then continue in what is a figure of 8 down the offside to the rear, and then around, checking wheels and suspension as you go, finishing at the near side front wheel. As you can see, I like to finish the under bonnet checks with the steering being rocked under load. Then when I come underside, I start with those same checks, and that gives me continuity.
And as you've still got the engine running, it makes sense to do the checks that you need the engine running for.
Yeah, lots of testers, they like to have a routine where they'll keep the engine running for the minimum amount of time. So they would do all their steering checks, and they would have the brakes pressured right across the vehicle, right through to the rear of the vehicle, checking all the brake components, checking the fuel components and pipes, etc., and checking the exhaust system for any major leaks, right from the engine point right through to the tailpipe. And then, of course, they would switch the engine off and start again at the front on their figure 8.
Okay, so what do we need to check here at the front?
Right, all the testable components really. So we'd start, let's say, doing static checks on steering components, and then checking suspension components, using a lever or bar as they needed to on certain suspension items. For prescribed area, it'd be finger thumb pressure, checking up in those areas, coming across to this side of the vehicle. If necessary, they'd be using the corrosion assessment tool, yeah? Right round, coming back, and to a point behind the front offside wheel.
And as this is an ATL, does that make a difference to the procedure, Tom?
Well, only in that when they're carrying out these checks, because they don't have an assistant, they're obviously not instructing anybody, so they would check the steering with the steering play detectors. They've got the pedal pusher applicator on, so they've got all those lines under pressure and the engine's running. They can carry out all those checks I've mentioned on fuel and exhaust and so on. And then for the suspension, they would operate the wheel play detectors to check any play in the suspension. And then of course they'd lower the hoist, switch the engine off and remove the brake applicator. They also make sure that the vehicle is chocked. We'd start from behind this front offside wheel and checking the vehicle structure as we go down, all the prescribed areas, checking brake pipes for security, checking fuel pipes, checking the exhaust system for security, just gradually working our way, as I say, finger thumb pressure, corrosion assessment tool if necessary, and end up at a point in front of the rear offside wheel. Now, what I and most testers like to do at this point is go outside the ramp, and then we'll go back along the sill and check the outer sill for corrosion and all the prescribed areas and so on.
So logically then, you'd check the offside rear wheel and its associated suspension and braking components, moving across the rear of the vehicle to the near side, Tom, and then up the near side, checking all of the items that we checked on the offside.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, if this had rear wheel steering, you'd need to remember to check all of those steering components.
Okay, so that's the figure of 8 check completed. Do we now jack the front of the vehicle?
Yes, we do. And I mentioned earlier about chocking the wheels. Well, if the park brake were on the front wheels, yeah, we would definitely need to chock at this time and then jack the vehicle up and release the park brake so that we can now make sure that all the wheel bearings are free for checking.
And either way, if we're jacking the vehicle, we need to jack it in the appropriate way for whatever suspension type is fitted.
Yeah, well done. So you're doing that suspension DVD's paid off, isn't it?
Yeah.
And of course, when it's jacked up, we'll carry out all the checks that are required on the front suspension and on the wheel bearings and on the tyres, and then we'll lower it down onto the turn plates or lower it down and move it onto the turn plates. Right. Now we've got the vehicle resting on free moving turn plates, and we'll either have the rear wheels chocked or we'll have the park brake on, and we can carry out the lock-to-lock checks. If this were a vehicle fitted with a beam axle, then we could do these checks when it's raised on the jack. If we're power steering, we'd have to have the engine running in either case.
And once again, if this was a manual setup, you'd use the assistant to turn the steering on full lock.
Yes, you would, but you need to remember that the tester also has to turn the steering wheel from lock to lock so that they can feel for roughness or tightness in the steering.
And you also need to shake and rock the road wheels for the suspension joint checks on non-ATL equipment, don't you?
Yes, and then we jack the rear and carry out the checks on wheel bearings, tyres and suspension before moving on to the brake performance test.
So Tom, we've moved the vehicle off the hoist to carry out our brake test, be that a roller brake tester, plate brake test, or in the case of some vehicles, a decelerometer test.
Yes, and we would follow the on-screen prompts if this was an ATL, or the appropriate procedures in any other case. It's important to make a note of the brake figures because we would need to enter those onto the VTS device.
So that only leaves the emissions test, which is something that needs to be done with the engine hot. So is that something to do at the beginning when the vehicle arrives for testing?
Yes, you could, if you were in a position to do that at the start of the test, and then of course that would save you having to warm the engine up later.
Would the tester ever do a road test?
Well, obviously, unless you've got a really big forecourt and you need to do a decelerometer test, you'd have to take it on the road. But a road test in itself is not part of the test. However, if the tester considered they'd need to check the result of an inspection, they can. In either case, they need to make sure it's safe and that they are qualified to take the vehicle on the road.
And if the tester found any dangerous defects, these need to be explained to the presenter.
That's important. They need to record it in the C box of the VT30 if they were issuing a refusal to test, or on a VT32 if it was a non-testable item.
And the VT32 would also be used for any advisory defects.
It's always good to issue advisories, Robert, and if the vehicle failed the test, then any testable advisory defects would need to be rechecked on the partial retest. Advisory documents are also useful for customers to report other additional items, peculiar things, say for example a seat missing.
So now we come to the final part of our routine, entering the test data and the result on the VTS device and printing out a certificate or a VT30 in the case of a failure.
And if necessary, a VT32 advisory document.
Well, there's clearly a lot to check, and I can see that this recommended routine has been well thought through.
Well, it's stood the test of time, and like in the aerospace industry, safety is paramount. If the routine works for them, it works for us too, and will keep our roads safe from dangerous vehicles.